The air in the hearing room is thick, electric, the kind of silence that comes only after something irreversible has been said. Flashes pop from reporters' cameras. A staffer drops a pen, and in that instant, the most powerful man in the House of Representatives pushes back his chair, his jaw tight, his eyes refusing to meet anyone else's. Mike Johnson, speaker, preacher, self-styled defender of discipline, stands up without a word. The room gasps. For a heartbeat, no one moves. Then murmurs ripple through the crowd like a sudden gust of wind. Someone whispers, "Is he leaving?" Another voice hisses, "He can't just walk out." He does. The door slams shut behind him, going through the chamber like a verdict. Freeze. A still frame of that moment, the look on his face, the disbelief on hers. The narrator's voice cuts through the silence. It was the question that silenced the Speaker of the House and made millions ask, what was he so afraid to answer? The screen fades to black. The sound of a gavel striking wood echoes faintly. Rewind. Suddenly, we're back in time. The chaos rewinds in slow motion. Staffers moving backward, papers uncrumpling, microphones rewinding words. The day begins again, pristine and calm. The Speaker walks into the hearing room, polished, confident, rehearsed. The press is lined up, expectant. He smiles that practiced smile, the kind that says he's ready for anything. But what he doesn't know, what none of them know, is that before this day is over, one question will puncture the armor he's worn for years. A question not shouted, but spoken calmly. A question that will make his silence louder than any speech he's ever given. The narrator lowers their voice. This wasn't just a political confrontation. It was a collision between truth and performance. Between the polished sermon and the unfiltered question, the screen flickers with news headlines. Each appearing for a split second, Speaker walks out. Crockett's viral moment. Washington in shock. Silence again. To understand why the Speaker walked out, the narrator says slowly, we have to go back to the moment he decided to walk in. It began as another hearing. Another day of Washington routine dressed up as responsibility. The Fiscal Responsibility Act, they called it. A bill meant to prove that the government could tighten its belt, that it could live within its means. But behind the polished phrases and policy charts, everyone in that room knew the truth. The stakes weren't about numbers on a spreadsheet. They were about power, perception, and who pays the price when politicians preach about discipline. The nation was days away from a potential shutdown. Federal workers braced for furloughs. Small towns feared the lights going dark. The markets trembled at every rumor drifting from the Capitol. In the middle of it all stood Speaker Mike Johnson, the man who had promised to restore order. After months of chaos, he entered that committee room with a calm practiced over decades. His posture was upright, his voice steady, his tone that of a teacher who believes the lesson has already been learned. He spoke of fiscal stewardship, of sacrifice, of tough choices. Each word rolled out like a sermon meant to reassure the faithful and remind the critics who was in charge. But there was something unusual about that day. It isn't common for a sitting speaker to appear before a committee, especially one filled with members eager to test his convictions. Some saw courage, others saw hubris. But everyone knew this would not be a routine exchange. Across the aisle, Jasmine Crockett listened quietly. Her notepad was filled not with slogans, but with evidence. She wasn't there for theater. She was there for truth. Her reputation had already become legend in political circles. Calm under pressure, razor-sharp in logic, fearless in delivery. Where others saw confrontation, she saw clarity waiting to be revealed to her. Fiscal discipline was not an abstract principle. It was a moral question. Because when Washington tightens its belt, it's never the powerful who feel the squeeze. It's the single mother in Dallas watching her grocery bill climb. It's the retired veteran waiting on a check that may not come. It's the young immigrant who works 2 jobs just to afford a sliver of the American dream. And that's where the tension lived. Between policy and principle. Between what was said and what was real. The speaker continued listing cuts, citing numbers, his tone unwavering. He spoke of burden sharing, of deficit realities, of hard truths. But beneath the confidence, there was something brittle, an inflexibility disguised as conviction. He had built his brand on certainty, and certainty leaves no room for questions. Jasmine knew it, and she was patient. She let him finish, let the applause from his allies echo and fade. Then quietly, she flipped to the next page of her notes. This was not personal, not yet, but it was moral. It was about accountability, about the stories hidden behind the spreadsheets, and soon she would make that truth visible. The narrator's voice lowers, carrying the weight of inevitability. When an unstoppable calm meets an unshakable truth, one of them must break. And on that day, in that room, everyone was about to find out which. The chairman cleared his throat. The murmurs died. A hush fell over the chamber as the next name was called, and when the chairman said, "The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized," every camera lens in America turned. Before the storm of flashbulbs and viral headlines, there was the myth of Mike Johnson, the man who rose from chaos to claim the gavel he was never supposed to hold. His ascent was not the result of a grand movement or sweeping mandate. It was a moment of desperation, a vacuum that needed filling when Washington had exhausted every other option. In the aftermath of political implosions and party infighting, Johnson appeared like a man conjured out of necessity, calm, polite, unassuming. The accidental speaker. Cameras loved him because he didn't shout. Commentators praised his composure, his soft-spoken certainty. To a weary public, he looked like a cure for the noise, someone who could restore order through quiet conviction. But quiet can be deceptive. Still waters, after all, often hide the strongest currents. He built his brand on discipline, fiscal, moral, personal. In every speech, he wrapped austerity in the language of virtue. The nation must live within its means, he would say, his tone more sermon than statement. He spoke of accountability, of responsibility, of self-reliance, and in doing so, he built a moral framework where poverty was seen less as a problem to be solved and more as a lesson to be learned. To many, it was comforting. A story where every hardship had a reason, every inequality a justification. But to others, it reeked of selective empathy, compassion that always stopped short of the powerful. Press conferences became his pulpit. He would stand at the podium, Bible-thin folders stacked neatly beside him, and weave scripture into policy. Cameras rolled as he spoke of stewardship and divine order. The message was always the same. The government's first duty was not to uplift, but to restrain. Not to provide, but to punish excess. And somehow, the excess never seemed to belong to those already sitting at the top. He told America it needed to sacrifice. But his version of sacrifice never touched the subsidies that padded corporate profits, the tax breaks that swelled billionaire fortunes, or the loopholes that turned wealth into immunity. Instead, his fiscal sermons landed hardest on the working class, the very people whose sweat built the foundation he now preached from. It was a contradiction too elegant to be accidental. Johnson's calm wasn't detachment. It was control. His faith wasn't compassion. It was conviction sharpened into ideology. And his calls for responsibility carried an unspoken clause. Some people would always bear more of it than others. Political insiders whispered that he never sought power, that it sought him. And that was true, in a way. He hadn't clawed his way to the gavel like others before him. He'd simply waited, quietly, as his colleagues tore each other apart. When the smoke cleared, he was the only one left standing. The man no one feared enough to block. But power obtained through chaos carries a curse. The same silence that made him seem composed also made him hollow. He entered office with the confidence of a man certain of his righteousness, but unsure of his mandate. Every decision became a sermon. Every press briefing, a homily on thrift and order. He became the speaker of restraint in a government addicted to contradiction. And yet, behind the polished surface, there was something brittle. His calm wasn't the serenity of wisdom. It was the stillness of a man clinging to certainty in a world that kept changing without his permission. He could quote scripture with ease, but when confronted with suffering, he defaulted to platitude. He saw moral decay everywhere except where it was profitable. That was the irony. It's a man who rose out of chaos preaching order, who built his reputation on balance while tipping the scales, who claimed humility yet wielded power like it was ordained in another world. He might have remained a footnote, a soft-spoken congressman from Louisiana with strong opinions and little reach. But history has a way of rewarding confidence mistaken for clarity. And so there he stood, the untested speaker at the center of a fiscal storm, lecturing the nation about sacrifice while refusing to look directly at who sacrificing the most. The narrator's tone tightens, analytical but edged with unease. Mike Johnson didn't see himself as the villain. To him, he was the custodian of order in a fallen world, a man standing against waste, excess, and moral decay. But conviction without compassion becomes cruelty dressed in righteousness, and that's where his story began to unravel. He believed every word he said that day, every statistic, every metaphor, every invocation of virtue. But across the aisle sat someone who had built her career dismantling contradictions, exactly like his. Long before the bright lights of C-SPAN and the endless scroll of social media feeds, there was a small courtroom in Dallas where a young attorney stood before a judge, her voice steady but sharp enough to cut through arrogance. The case was simple, a landlord accused of exploiting tenants who couldn't afford to fight back. The odds were uneven. The room was heavy with the quiet assumption that power would prevail. But Jasmine Crockett didn't do assumptions. She did facts, precision, and persistence. Every word she spoke landed like a chisel against stone. By the time she finished, the courtroom wasn't quiet out of courtesy. It was quiet because everyone had realized she'd just shifted the ground beneath them. That was her rhythm. Late nights bent over briefs that most lawyers wouldn't take. Mornings spent defending people whose names never made the news. She built her career in the trenches of injustice, where the law was both weapon and shield, and she wielded it with the kind of control that made opponents uneasy. There were no camera crews, no headlines, no applause, just the steady hum of fluorescent lights, the shuffle of papers, the quiet satisfaction of holding power accountable. The narrator's voice draws closer, more intimate now. Before she was Congresswoman Crockett, she was Attorney Crockett, the woman who made powerful men sweat on the witness stand. She didn't come from wealth or connections. Her power wasn't inherited. It was earned through repetition, through every moment she refused to be underestimated. When others learned to read between the lines, she learned to rewrite them, and she never forgot where she came from. Every client she defended, every injustice she challenged, it became part of the fuel that drove her. Not anger, but purpose. Not revenge, but restoration. That was the difference. Where others sought to win arguments, she sought to reveal truth. Flash forward, a campaign trail in Texas, heat shimmering on the asphalt, volunteers sweating through t-shirts, holding up handmade signs, Jasmine's voice amplified through a portable mic, cuts through the summer air. If we don't stand up for our people, then who will? Justice isn't something you wait for, it's something you demand. She wasn't polished in the conventional sense. She didn't perform politics. She practiced it like law, building arguments, dismantling deceit, giving voice to those who'd been told to stay quiet. Her authenticity wasn't strategy. It was survival. That's what made her rise so magnetic. In an age of scripted sound bites and hollow branding, she was raw conviction in motion. When she spoke, she didn't perform empathy. She projected it. People felt seen, heard, represented, and that reputation followed her to Washington and Congress. She was the freshman with the fire of a veteran. She studied the game but refused to play it the old way. Where others postured, she prepared. When others grandstanded for the cameras, she used the camera to expose contradictions. In hearings, she became a kind of legend. It's not for theatrics, but for her precision. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her logic did the heavy lifting. There was a quiet confidence in her questioning, a surgical rhythm that made witnesses shift in their seats. Long before she delivered the final line that would echo across the internet, she once said in an interview, "If you know the truth, you don't have to shout. You just have to let them talk long enough to expose themselves." That's who she was, the calm in the middle of someone else's chaos. Her colleagues called her relentless. Her opponents called her dangerous. But those who truly understood knew she was something rarer, unshakable, because behind every question she asked was a story. A veteran denied benefits, a mother priced out of her home, a teacher watching her school defunded while billionaires bragged about tax cuts. Each example wasn't just a statistic. It was a person she'd met, a truth she'd carried into the chamber like evidence in a courtroom. Her weapon wasn't outrage. It was clarity, and in a political landscape built on performance. Clarity is lethal. So when the fiscal responsibility hearing was announced, when Mike Johnson, the new speaker, decided to testify, Jasmine didn't see it as a spectacle. She saw it as a moment of reckoning, a test of principle against performance. The speaker had built his career lecturing the nation about responsibility, about sacrifice, about living within its means. But Jasmine had lived those sacrifices. She'd seen what fiscal responsibility looked like from the ground up. The closed clinics, the empty fridges, the quiet despair of families told to tighten their belts while corporations loosened theirs. She understood something deeper, that hypocrisy, dressed as discipline, is still hypocrisy. And that's what she carried into that room. Not anger, not ego, but evidence. Years of watching the same play performed under new titles, of watching power define morality in its own image. That morning, when she buttoned her blazer and walked toward the hearing room, she wasn't thinking about headlines. She was thinking about accountability, the kind that doesn't need volume to make impact. She knew the man she was about to question had never been publicly cornered like this before. She also knew that truth when spoken without fear. It's a way of stripping even the most confident down to silence. The narrator's tone shifts. It's building anticipation like a held breath. She had faced prosecutors, politicians, and power brokers. But this was different. Because on that day, she wasn't just defending her district. She was defending the idea that integrity still has a place in American power. A long pause. And on that day, facing the most powerful man in Congress. She brought all of it with her. The air in the hearing room felt denser when Chairman Cummer's gavel struck the wood. The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes. It wasn't just another procedural handoff. It was the ignition of something volatile. Jasmine Crockett straightened in her seat, eyes fixed on the man across from her. Speaker Mike Johnson adjusted his red tie, the fabric gleaming faintly beneath the harsh committee lights. The cameras shifted with precision, their motors humming like restless insects. Every reporter knew this was the moment to record. Every staffer felt it in their bones. Something unscripted was about to happen. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," Crockett began, her voice steady and deliberate. "And thank you, Mr. Speaker, for appearing before us today." It was polite, measured, but layered beneath the courtesy was steel. Johnson nodded faintly, his face composed, but his right hand betrayed him. The pen between his fingers tapped twice against the table, quick and sharp. Crockett continued, "You've said your Fiscal Responsibility Act is about discipline, about reducing our national debt, about difficult choices." "That's correct," Johnson replied smoothly. "We must make responsible cuts to restore balance to our nation's finances." Her gaze didn't waver. "And yet," she said, flipping open a folder, "your record tells a different story." A murmur rolled through the room like a low tide. Cameras inched closer. On one screen, a split view appeared. Crockett calm and surgical. Johnson the faintest tightening at the corner of his jaw. "In 2017, she said, "you voted for the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, a bill that added nearly $2 trillion to the national debt. Did you express concerns about fiscal responsibility then?" Johnson leaned forward slightly, his rehearsed tone steady. "Those cuts were designed to spur economic growth, Congresswoman. Responsible governance means knowing when investment pays off." Crockett tilted her head, eyes sharp. "So deficit spending is acceptable when it benefits corporations?" A rustle from the Democratic side, someone stifled a knowing smile. On the Republican side, papers shuffled. "I wouldn't characterize it that way," Johnson said quickly. "We're talking about policies that strengthen the economy." She nodded slowly, as though cataloging the dodge. "Understood. Then let's talk about 2019. You voted for a $94 billion increase in defense spending, with no offsets. You called it, and I quote, essential funding that cannot be delayed or reduced. Were you concerned about the deficit then?" The temperature in the room shifted, not literally, but perceptibly. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed louder. "Defense spending is a constitutional duty," Johnson replied, his voice tightening around the words. "And programs that feed hungry families aren't a moral one." Crockett asked. Calm level, across the dais, someone whispered. "She's walking him into it." Johnson's jaw flexed. "We're discussing fiscal priorities, not moral equivalencies." Crockett leaned slightly forward. Not in aggression, but precision. "I'd argue that's exactly what fiscal priorities are." A beat of silence. Pens stopped moving. The room was still. She continued, voice steady as a surgeon's hand. "You supported a $200 million infrastructure project in your own district in 2020. In your press release, federal investment in local communities builds prosperity for all. No mention of deficit concerns there either." Johnson's throat tightened as he reached for his glass of water. The camera caught the faint tremor in his hand. "Congresswoman," he said, his voice clipped, "context matters. Infrastructure stimulates local economies, and cutting nutrition assistance doesn't." She countered. Gasps, small, involuntary, rippled across the room. Her tone never rose. She didn't need to. The power was in the precision. One by one, her questions stacked like dominoes, each knocking against the next. His votes for tax breaks, his silence on corporate subsidies, his sudden vigilance when the spending helped the poor. Every answer he gave revealed another inconsistency, another fracture in his carefully polished rhetoric. Viewers at home leaned closer to their screens. Commentators would later describe it as the moment the temperature dropped in the hearing room. And yet, through it all, Crockett remained composed. Not triumphant, not taunting, just resolute. A woman who had done this dance before, who understood that the most devastating cross-examination isn't loud, it's precise. Johnson's calm was beginning to thin. His responses grew shorter, his explanations more defensive. He straightened his tie again, a tell his staff knew well. Crockett glanced at the clock. Her time was nearly up. She gathered her papers slowly, giving him space, or perhaps the illusion of it. "Mr. Speaker," she said softly, almost kindly, "you've spoken eloquently about fiscal responsibility. You've cited it as your guiding principle. But from your record, that principle seems selective." He shifted in his chair. "That's an unfair characterization." "Then perhaps," she said, pausing, her tone quiet, deliberate, "you can help me understand something." The entire room leaned in. Every camera zoomed tight. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Her next line would become the most replayed moment in political television that year. And then, the narrator whispers, the sound fading into a long, cinematic silence. She asked the question that no one, least of all the speaker, was prepared to answer. For a moment, everything in the hearing room froze. The cameras, the murmurs, even the restless shuffling of papers, all silenced by the gravity of what was unfolding. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, her voice calm but charged with a quiet electricity. "Mr. Speaker," she began, "throughout your career you've spoken often about fiscal responsibility. You voted to cut nutrition programs, housing support, healthcare funding, all in the name of reducing the deficit." Johnson nodded, tight-lipped, already anticipating the next question. "But I've looked through your record," she continued, the faintest glint in her eyes, "and I can't find a single instance, Not one. Were you opposed a tax cut or a spending measure benefiting the wealthy or corporations because of that same concern? Her gaze didn't waver. So, Mr. Speaker, she said, her tone sharpening with precision, can you name one time, just one, when you opposed a tax cut for the wealthy because of deficit concerns? The question landed like a gavel to the chest. The air in the room went still. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to grow louder than the speaker's silence. For the first time that day, Mike Johnson didn't have a rehearsed response. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. The composure he'd spent years perfecting flickered like a candle in a gust of wind across the committee dais. Aides exchanged glances. A reporter's fingers hovered above a keyboard, frozen mid-keystroke. Camera zoomed in, tight on his face, catching every flicker of uncertainty. Finally, Johnson cleared his throat. Throughout my time in Congress, he began, voice softer now, I've approached fiscal matters with consistency, with principles of responsible governance. Crockett murmured lightly, not interrupting, just redirecting. That wasn't my question, Mr. Speaker. A soft ripple of gasps spread through the room. Even her tone carried surgical precision. Not mocking, but unrelenting, I asked. She said, her voice steady for a specific example. A single instance where you opposed a tax cut for the wealthy, or a spending bill that benefited corporations specifically because of your concern about the deficit. Johnson's jaw flexed. His fingers tapped once, twice, against the table before curling into a fist. In the 2021 infrastructure bill, he said, I opposed tax incentives for green energy corporations. I did so because you opposed them, Crockett interjected gently. Because you said the government shouldn't pick winners and losers in the energy market? I read your floor speech, Mr. Speaker. You never mentioned the deficit. Low murmur rippled again. Staffers shifting, reporters typing. The first flurry of real tension breaking through the room's still air. Johnson inhaled sharply. Well, in the corporate investment bill of 2022, you voted for that one? Crockett replied immediately, pulling out a page. Your press release praised it for creating jobs and opportunity. Again, no mention of deficit concerns. The pause that followed was brutal. The control booth director for C-SPAN whispered, stay split screen. Don't miss her face. Don't miss his eyes. Crockett didn't move, didn't gloat. She simply waited. Her silence was the scalpel. Johnson adjusted his tie again, the same nervous tell. He reached for his water glass, his hand trembling almost imperceptibly. Congresswoman, he said, forcing his tone back to even. This line of questioning is clearly designed for theatrics, not policy. With respect, Mr. Speaker, she replied softly. It's designed for truth. And the word truth hit the room like a detonation. For a heartbeat, you could feel the balance shift. The speaker's authority, his aura of calm control, beginning to fracture under the weight of his own record, he tried again. I have always stood for responsible spending, for ensuring our children aren't saddled with debt, except, she said, when that debt comes from helping the already powerful. That single, quiet line would later replay millions of times. Across every social platform in America, the hashtags appeared within seconds. Hashtag answer the question. Hashtag storm out speaker. Crockett question. In real time, the comments were already rolling in. She's dismantling him point by point. Finally, someone asking what we've all been thinking. That silence said everything. The hearing room, though. It was quieter than prayer. Chairman Cummer cleared his throat. The gentlewoman has 30 seconds remaining. Crockett nodded without breaking eye contact. Then I'll just say this, she said. The American people deserve to know that when you talk about responsibility, it means responsibility for everyone, not just those without lobbyists. Johnson's face flushed red. His voice rose, the calm veneer cracking. Congresswoman, this kind of grandstanding asterisk, this kind of accountability, she corrected softly, and that's when it happened. The moment that would be replayed in slow motion. Dissected on cable news, memmed across social platforms, and remembered for years. Johnson pushed back from the table. Papers scattered slightly. His voice, sharp, defensive, and utterly unlike the careful diplomat he'd always been, cut through the silence. This is nothing but political theater. He snapped, standing abruptly. If you think sound bites will solve our fiscal crisis, you're mistaken. I will not participate in this spectacle. The shock was instant. Reporters jumped to their feet. Staffers whispered frantically into phones. The chairman tried to interject. Mr. Speaker, you are still under questioning. But Johnson wasn't listening. His chair scraped back, harsh against the floor. I'm done here, he said flatly, his voice now shaking with anger. This committee deserves better than cheap shots and bad faith interrogations. Crockett's eyes followed him, calm, unflinching. The record will reflect, she said quietly, that the speaker declined to answer. Her voice carried, even steady, deliberate. The sentence landed like a verdict, and then silence. Johnson gathered his papers in a flurry of movement and stormed toward the exit. Cameras followed every step. A reporter called out, Mr. Speaker, Why couldn't you name one? He paused for a fraction of a second, turned as if to respond, then stopped. The door opened. He walked out. The room erupted. The sound of reporters typing filled the chamber. Lawmakers whispered to aides, glancing up at the screens where the playback was already looping. The Speaker of the House had just walked out of a live congressional hearing because of one unanswerable question. By the time he reached the hallway, the clip was already trending. Millions were watching within minutes. Tweets and TikToks cut the silence between Crockett's.com precision and Johnson's exit. Split-screen edits flooded the timeline, captions reading, "He couldn't name one." Cable news rolled the footage on loop. Pundits called it a moment of political truth, a career-defining implosion, the question that cracked the calm. And over it all, the narrator's voice rose, low and deliberate, threading through the chaos, in an age where power often hides behind polished rhetoric. It wasn't a shout that broke the facade. It was a question so simple, so undeniable, that even the most powerful man in Congress couldn't face it. The last image before the fade, Crockett sitting quietly, hands folded over her notes, the faintest glint of resolve in her eyes as cameras flashed all around her. And then the narrator says, the words hanging like a final echo in front of millions. The Speaker did something no one expected. He walked out. For a few seconds after the door closed, no one in the hearing room moved. The sound of Mike Johnson's footsteps faded down the marble corridor, swallowed by the stunned quiet he left behind. Then, chaos. Reporters bolted from their seats, cameras swung toward the exit, and the once sterile chamber erupted into a storm of questions and ringing phones. "Mr. Speaker, why walk out?" "Congresswoman, any comment?" The air crackled with urgency. Outside, the hallway filled with noise, the thrum of footsteps, the rapid-fire clicks of shutters, aides whispering into phones as though trying to rewrite what had just happened. But it was already too late. The clip was everywhere. Within minutes, social media exploded. Hashtags climbed the charts like fireworks. Hashtag storm out, Speaker. Hashtag answer the question. Hashtag Crockett vs. Johnson. The video of his walkout hit 1 million views before the hearing had even adjourned. Cable networks broke from programming to air it live. Pundits leaned forward in studio chairs, trying to sound authoritative while watching the footage loop on silent screens. "It's extraordinary," said one anchor. "I've never seen a Speaker of the House walk out of a committee hearing." Another added that silence said more than any statement could. "You can't preach responsibility and run from the receipts." Meanwhile, the camera feed cut back to the committee room, where Jasmine Crockett remained seated, calm as ever. No smirk, no gloat. Just quiet composure. Her pen tapped once against her notepad before she closed it neatly and rose to leave. That single act, the restraint, the poise, became the defining image of the day in the hours that followed. Admiration poured in from every corner of the country. Editorial headlines wrote themselves. The question that silenced power. Crockett's calm shatters Washington double standard. Clips flooded TikTok, each remix punctuated with the same stunned silence before Johnson's exit. At the same time, Johnson's team scrambled. Anonymous aides tried to downplay the moment. The Speaker was pressed for time. It was a procedural misunderstanding, but no one was buying it. Even members of his own party privately admitted it looked bad. One strategist muttered to a reporter, "You can't preach strength and walk out mid-sentence." What had begun as a hearing on fiscal policy had become something far larger, a referendum on credibility. Crockett gave a brief press statement outside the Capitol. Her tone remained composed, almost judicial. "It's never about the volume," she said. "It's about the truth. And if you stand on truth, you don't have to run from questions." That clip alone was shared tens of thousands of times. Each caption a variation of the same sentiment. This is what leadership looks like. For Johnson, the fallout was relentless. Overnight, donors called. Allies hesitated. Editorial boards questioned whether his moral language still carried any weight. The Speaker, who had built his brand on discipline, now found himself the face of avoidance. Political irony doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it just echoes. The man who came to defend fiscal responsibility had instead exposed fiscal hypocrisy. The man who wanted to project control had walked into the one thing he couldn't manage. The truth caught on camera. Even conservative pundits admitted it. "He walked right into it," one said. That was a rookie mistake from a man who should have known better. But amid the chaos, something deeper began to shift. People who'd never heard Jasmine Crockett's name before now spoke of her with reverence. For those who'd grown weary of evasion and double talk, her calm clarity felt like oxygen. It wasn't just about winning an argument. It was about restoring a sense of accountability that had gone missing in Washington's theater of spin. Late that night, as newsrooms ran their final segments, one commentator summed it up perfectly. In 5 minutes, one congresswoman reminded America that truth still has a pulse. The image of Johnson's empty chair lingered on the screen, symbolic, almost cinematic, and as the narrator's voice returned, Quiet but resolute, it framed the moment not as a scandal, but as a turning point. In the corridors of power, silence used to be a shield. Today it became an admission. And across the country, millions of Americans, tired, skeptical, hungry for honesty, finally saw what accountability sounds like. The montage closed with Crockett walking down the Capitol steps, the evening light catching her profile, her phone buzzing endlessly with notifications she never looked at. She didn't need to. The message had already spread, but as the screen darkened and the music slowed to a hum, one line appeared hanging like a promise or a warning. But the ripples of that 5-minute exchange didn't stop there. Weeks passed, but the echo of that question refused to fade. The Fiscal Responsibility Act, the bill Johnson had once championed as his defining legacy, began to unravel under scrutiny. Lawmakers withdrew support. Hearings stalled. By the time it reached the floor again, it was no longer the symbol of discipline he had promised, but a casualty of exposed contradiction. Cable networks replayed the hearing on anniversaries of historic/Ks. Editorials dubbed it the 5 minutes that redefined accountability. Even late-night hosts, usually jaded, treated the moment with a kind of awe. They weren't laughing at Washington's chaos anymore. They were marveling at the rare sight of truth piercing through it. For Mike Johnson, the decline was slow but undeniable. His approval ratings sank. Once loyal colleagues began using words like unforced error and credibility issue, he stopped doing unscripted interviews. Every public appearance carried the ghost of that silence, that long, devastating pause after. Can you name one time? But for Jasmine Crockett, everything changed. She became the face of a different kind of politics, one rooted not in outrage, but in resolve. Her calmness, her precision, her refusal to grandstand became legend. It wasn't the question that made her viral. It was the dignity behind it. Clips of her exchange played in classrooms, on civic TikTok pages, at community centers. Activists quoted her in speeches. And across the country, people found themselves asking their own version of that question. To politicians, bosses, even themselves. When have I stood for principle when it wasn't convenient? The narrator's voice returns, soft but unwavering. In an era of spin, one question cut through the noise. One woman reminded America that integrity isn't about how loudly you speak. It's about whether your words still mean something when they cost you comfort. The montage widens. From the Capitol steps to factory floors, classrooms, and kitchen tables. The story isn't just about one hearing anymore. It's about what the moment revealed. That accountability still matters. That silence can no longer hide hypocrisy. That courage doesn't always shout sometimes. It simply refuses to look away. The narrator continues. Principles mean nothing if they only apply when convenient. Power means nothing if it can't withstand the truth. And history doesn't remember the loudest voices. It remembers the ones that held their ground. Then the tone shifts. Gentle, direct, a call to conscience. If you believe integrity still matters, if you believe truth deserves defenders, then make sure this story is heard. Like it, share it, talk about it. Because every time a question like this echoes, democracy gets a little stronger. The music swells, solemn but resolute. The sound of something greater than politics fade to black.